So I was working with Molly Connolly on a project called Elusive Moose. It was a company that she and I started a couple years ago as a business resource for software developers. I'm no longer working with Molly on that project, but there was a resource that we'd put together that focused on what we're calling 10 elements of a software development project. And I wanted to share that with you, and there's actually a white paper still on the Elusive Moose website. It's just elusivemoose.com, and you'll see a banner that says struggling to manage your software development projects. You click on that, and you can download this white paper. And it goes into some more detail about what I'm going to talk about here. I'll keep this kind of brief and just give you kind of an overview. But the point of the 10 elements of a software project is, in my experience, managing some pretty large development projects, both in the FileMaker platform and in other platforms and other languages like .NET, and did some Salesforce customization projects, and they all kind of have the same issues, right? You're consulting with clients, you're building something that's custom, and it's a very creative and very collaborative process that you experience with other human beings, and you have to find the chemistry and find a way of setting proper expectations and executing this project in a way that everybody's satisfied. So as a project manager over the years, I was introduced to an agile method for developing projects back in 2005. And I took that methodology, which had been really developed in the enterprise world. It was developed in in-house organizations where there were large development teams of, say, 7 to 10 developers working on projects over many years. And that was sort of where the original agile way of developing software originated. I was working for a FileMaker shop, and we were doing very small projects in relative terms. We were doing 100 to 200 hour projects with a team of maybe 1 developer instead of teams of 7 to 10 developers. But we were able to take the concepts of what we were reading about in these books and pull out the parts of the processes that made sense for us working as consultants with clients, and kind of let the other stuff go. And from that came a methodology that worked very well in the small consulting space. Well, over the years, I not only managed many projects, but also coached and trained other shops in these methods. And it gave me a really interesting view into how people approach the management of custom software projects. It wasn't just my own world that I was dealing with. I was also able to look at the way other development shops had evolved over the years and how they were dealing with the same issues, and in some cases help them implement this methodology into their world. So all that experience, about 10 years of experience managing projects and training and coaching other shops, really from all that experience emerged these 10 things, these 10 attributes of a project that I realized no matter what the methodology is, or whether or not you even have a process or a framework that you're using with your projects, regardless, you're dealing with these 10 things. You're responding and reacting to these 10 things. You're building or creating these 10 things, even if you don't really realize you are. And so what I found to be one of the core foundational pieces of good project management is recognizing these elements and being able to articulate first to yourself and then later to your clients or your stakeholders, articulating your process around these 10 things and being able to, in a few sentences, maybe explain or understand how you will handle these ideas. If you can do that confidently, then you've created a very good foundation to start with. So one of the things that I like to do with companies or other development shops is present these 10 ideas, these 10 elements, and ask them to self-audit. How do you address these issues with your customers or your stakeholders? How many here are consultants versus, we'll start with consultants, so you have external clients. Okay, about half. And then in-house, where your stakeholders work for the same company as you. Maybe, no, 1. Everybody else just...
So is that the difference between an in-house developer and an out-house developer?
Yes. Yes, I develop outhouses.
Yeah, I appreciate that label.
Jeremiah is an outhouse developer as well. So if you do find yourself in an in-house situation where you're working for a company you're developing in-house, you can still apply these principles because you still have stakeholders. But it's primarily written from the perspective of the consultant. So the questions that I ask, and that I ask myself and that I would challenge you to ask is, can you articulate your process around each of these elements? Can you say, if I were to ask you, well, how do you deal with the planning in your software project, or how do you deal with changes in scope or enhancements that come along as you develop your project? Can you tell me how you handle that, like what you do, and is it consistent? Is it something that do you handle it the same way? Do you have a structure or a system around it to be able to handle it and manage it? And most importantly, are you teaching this process or this methodology to your customer? Because in most cases, your customer has never been through a custom software development project, and if they have, chances are it wasn't a good experience because of the way that the industry has been over the years, where we've got fail rates that get advertised at being 50+%. In-house, not outhouse, not in the outhouse. Things are all good in the outhouse. So are you teaching this process to your clients when you're engaging with them? These are the 10 elements that have sort of emerged. And, this is, again, from my experience, the discovery of a project, scope, the kickoff, which is a very, very critical part of the process. The first meeting, the very first time you're engaging after the project's been approved, is the kickoff. Specific planning around features. The development and what you focus on when you're developing. This isn't about technical development. It's about sort of the process that wraps around the development. Testing the work. Reviewing the work with your customers. Reporting or delivering some sort of status to the client. How do you deal with changes that happen along the way? And then finally, your delivery, your deployment.
Do you have to deliver?
Pardon me?
You have to deliver.
Unfortunately, that is a part of the successful execution of a project, is actually handing the software over to someone to use.
Only if you want repeat.
Yeah. Yeah, if you're not interested in repeat business, you don't have to deliver anything.
Or any business.
Or any. Oh, boy. Sorry about the Y. That one slipped. That one slipped by QA.
Oh, I thought this was an elusive moose kind of thing.
Yeah, that's not a clever way of doing my slides. It's converting a Keynote to a Google slide.
It's not a mnemonic.
So discovery is some of this stuff is going to be pretty obvious, so I won't spend much time on it. Again, I just want to give you a quick overview. This is about information gathering. It's about learning the initial learning of what the client is interested in and what your stakeholder is interested in. And the reason that this is very important is because you need to be positioning yourself as an expert. You are being called in to consult. So in order to do that, you must be prepared. You must be very confident in your work. If you are going through the discovery process and you're not confident or you're unsure, you're letting the client lead the way, you're not building a lot of credibility or trust within that the project and the future engagement or relationship with the customer. So that's the discovery is that initial information gathering.
So is this kind of a Nietzschean man thing?
What's that?
A Nietzsche, Nietzsche, that philosopher.
Oh yeah, no, I'm not familiar. I mean, I know that who it is, but I can't. I've got old rock and roll ears, so I do apologize. I played, I was snare side, and it's just it was fine back in the '80s, but the scope is the result of that discovery, right? The scope is your roadmap. It's the thing. It's the measurable features. It's the definition of what you're going to be doing for the customer. The scope needs to be understandable to your users. The scope shouldn't be a technical document that's only understandable to you. That doesn't mean anything to them. They need to understand how they're going to measure success, and that typically happens by understanding what the features are going to be in the software and then knowing that they're completed because they can use them. So again, do you have a process around scope? Do you define your scope in a particular way? These are the questions that you would ask yourself when you're self-auditing your process. What does it look like? Is it consistent? And are you explaining to them what it is that they're looking at? Are you teaching and coaching that customer? Next is the kickoff. And I always talk about the kickoff as the critical moment in a project, and here's why. Because discovery and scope is all about the sales process, right? It's all about getting an understanding, understanding the need of the client, understanding where they want to go, what their goals and objectives are in order to change something in their business. At the point that the project is sold and the agreement is reached, it is the height of affection between the consultant and the client.
Not love. Oh.
It's a love fest. Let's be frank. All right. They have decided that of everywhere they have looked for someone to solve this problem, they have decided that you are it. Right? You are the one, the company or the individual who's going to come in and is going to solve that problem. And you, as a consultant or a developer, have decided that they are going to be a good client for you, and you are going to be able to help them solve this problem. So at no time in the process do you have this affection for one another and your future together. You can kill that very quickly by walking into the kickoff meeting and being unprepared, losing credibility, and ultimately blowing turning the love fest into a catch-up game, where you spend the rest of the project trying to convince them that you're as good as they thought you were before this moment. There are a few ways that I found that it's really easy to do that, and that is show up very well prepared, teach the process, let them know that you're in control. That first 5 minutes of that meeting, just imagine you walk into that kickoff meeting, that first meeting to start your project, and you sit down and you say, well, I'm not quite sure where to start. What do you guys think? That's not a good way to start a project, right? If I hire a roofer to come and put a roof on my house and they show up and say, not really sure if we should do the shingles or what, like what do you think?
Flashing.
Yeah, well, I don't know where we're going to go with that. I'm going to think I hired the wrong roofer. They might be the best roofer in town, but I'm going to think that I hired the wrong one. So you need to teach the process. You need to engage with them and be able to articulate how this project is going to unfold in those first minutes. And establish some patterns. Now, this is based on the Agile framework, so there's a lot of meetings and iterations, and there's communication that's involved. So you need to establish those things in that initial kickoff so that you can show them, hey, look, this is not my first time to the rodeo. This is how these projects unfold. Let them know that these certain things are going to happen. Let them know that you have experience doing that, and then get into the meeting. So that kickoff is a critical moment.
Meanwhile, you want to make them feel special and unique as well.
Oh, absolutely. Oh, absolutely.
I've seen this 50 times before, but you're special.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. So then we get into the deeper understanding of the features. So, when you do a discovery with somebody, keep in mind, especially if you're in the consulting business, you have to learn their business. I mean, you have to know how they do their job in order to do your job. And that's a lot of information to capture. That's right. And you're basically learning you're learning a new job every time you start a project. So while you can get an overview and you can write features and you can say the software will do X, Y, and Z, it is very difficult, even if your chosen framework suggests that you should do this. The Agile one doesn't, but it's very difficult to collect all of the detailed requirements that you would need during that initial discovery. So you're going to plan a more detailed way along the path, right? As you encounter features, you have to dig deeper and you have to find out things like, what are the exact fields that go on this? I mean, we can say it's a contact module and we have a name and contact information, but what does that actually mean? Do you really need a fax number nowadays? Do you need 2 phone numbers? Are there multiple contacts per customer? Those kinds of details are happening along the path. So the idea behind planning is how is it that you're collecting that detailed information? Are you focusing on only what's next? What does your process look like? Focusing on what is right in front of you to develop.
What would you say your favorite collection method is?
In terms of
Collecting information about the project as part of the planning. Like if regards to the specific features that they ask for?
Well, I think it just depends on kind of the feature. In other words, the framework that I use would be a cyclical development, iteration, right? So I'm going in, I'm saying these are the first set of features I'm going to use, or we're going to develop, and then I would sit down and talk through those features. If the feature if it's a rewriting an old database, I might capture screenshots. I might get a copy of the database. I might get a copy of the spreadsheet, a copy of a report if we're developing a report. And I'm just personally taking notes.
Sure.
If that's kind of where you're going with it.
Yeah.
I
wasn't sure if you had like forms that you like to follow.
Oh no, I don't have.
You like to ask,
I don't have specific questions. I sort of let that organically happen.
Is this where you also introduce the concept of regularly scheduled meetings?
Yeah, actually, during the kickoff is where I would introduce that concept and say, this project is estimated at X number of development hours, and therefore we're going to break that down into X number of iterations. And so, let's go ahead and schedule those meetings now. Let's get those on the books, so that we don't have to argue about trying to find a time to meet, during the project. But the planning is that sort of continued deep understanding. How do I do it? When do I do it? That's the process that I would be explaining to the customer. The development, I have very specific ideas around what I'm developing. I'm only developing what I just planned. I'm very intentional about not skipping ahead because I'm interested in, say, implementing that barcode feature, even though I know it's in the project, but I'm focusing on only the features that we're talking about right now. And the reason is because I'm not making an assumption. I'm not making an assumption that the barcode is actually going to be needed down the road. I had some very interesting experiences where, engaged in projects where the business priorities themselves changed dramatically over the course of the project. And if I were to go and skip ahead and be working on features that were in the original scope of the project but were maybe scheduled for a few months from now, by the time I get there, they may or may not actually be needed. So what I'm developing is just what I've just most recently planned.
Is there a verification step you like to? We agree this is what we want to do. I made you a prototype. You just stop and ask them, is this what you had in mind, or verify? Sign off. That's the review.
Really, it's the review of the iteration. I think they're tight enough. Typically, a 2-week iteration. Some of my clients, I'm actually doing weekly iterations.
I do weekly.
So with that, I'm developing, in a weekly iteration, I'm developing 15 hours of work. So really, it's so quick that I'm going right back to them with it, and I'm not veering off that far. That's kind of the idea of these agile frameworks where the development is cyclical versus we're going to define this whole project. I'm going to go away for 3 or 4 months, and I'm going to come back and give you your software.
That never works.
It does. It really doesn't. You can really PM the heck out of it, and I know people that have had success with it. It didn't work for me when I had tried to do it, and the more communicative approach just fit my personality and fit my style a lot better. So that's what I
think times are changing. I think people in the past may have thought that was normal, and I think nowadays people kind of expect
the more
the agile iteration process.
Yeah,
It's more personal too. I've noticed they want their hand held.
absolutely. They haven't been through this process before. That's the one thing to keep in mind is that you really are the expert, and they aren't, and there's an expectation that you're going to guide them through.
You still need to tell them that we're meeting every day.
Oh, no question about that.
No doubt about that.
Yeah, no doubt.
They're not as shocked anymore to hear that.
Right. Please test your work. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night. Test all of your deliverables. The best thing that's happened in the world of testing are videos and screencasts and things like that, because if you're a solo developer, making a video to demonstrate the feature is the best way to find all of the bugs that will slip right by you, and actually execute the feature exactly the way that you would expect the user to execute that feature. You will find out very quickly that your tab order never got reset, and that you tab from here down to there. and then up to there, and then over to there.
Don't test it the day of your meeting.
Yeah, try not to test it like right before the meeting either. But you can use an external tester. You know, you can use somebody who's non-technical who would represent a user and just say, please try this. But making videos I have found to be a great way of just immediately testing your work. Because as soon as that red light comes on, it's like 30 takes later you finally got it because you had to stop and go fix that, and then stop and go fix that, and then stop and go fix that.
Is all that testing being done by basically you and your staff and not involving the client at this point?
You're right, because we haven't reviewed with the client yet. So we definitely want to test the stuff before we send it over to the client or we show it to the client to review, because the whole egg on your face during the review meeting it really feels
You
uncomfortable.
definitely don't want the electrician to make you the tester.
Right.
Not
Right.
very cool.
I'm thinking more along the lines of the stupid things users do.
Yeah.
Oh,
Do.
yeah.
Testing for those.
You can be really good at this part, and there's still going to be stuff,
Yeah, you're never gonna get along. Never gonna get along.
and that's where really the user or the beta testing comes into play.
There's two basic kinds of testing too. There's testing to prove it works and testing to prove it doesn't work.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, that's a great way of thinking
It's
about it.
impossible for a developer to test that it does not work. You get into psychology cramps when you start doing that. So to prove that it doesn't work, it has to be tested by somebody other than the developer.
That's an excellent way of articulating that. Yeah, it's parallel to the proofreader.
Yep.
How you read words that don't exist.
Yep.
Because you wrote them.
But Jim, ultimately, a lot of people don't have that flexibility.
No,
So
no,
if you are a solo
but,
shop,
but
test your
it's
work.
one of those things. Just be aware that you've got a
Yeah.
blind spot
Yeah.
because
Yes.
you're going. If you are the only tester, you don't
Yeah.
have anybody else to test for you. You are not going to be able to catch every flaw because you are going to go in and make sure that it's doing everything it's supposed to do.
You're already
Right.
you're already
How it's
inherently
supposed to work.
you're already inherently
Because
knowing you're not good at it.
yeah, well, and everything to you at that point is there's also white box and black box testing, and at that point, everything to you is white box. You know everything that's inside going on.
Yeah.
And so you know how to get it to work. And so somebody that's testing black box should not, when testing to prove it doesn't work, should be black box. They should have no idea what's going on inside the app itself. So,
Yeah, those are great thoughts. I found that when developers test for each other, like if you have another developer, and you say, "Well, I'll test for you, test for me," make sure you're not fixing the other person's stuff. Make sure you're viewing it from that perspective. Yeah. But so again, I'm just going to reiterate the questions. Do you have a process for this? Is it consistent? And are you explaining that to your client? As a solo developer, sometimes I do offload some testing to my client, especially if I have a good relationship and I've got a long-term relationship with that client. I might say, "Hey, look, I'm going to do this, and then I want you to test it." They understand my situation. I don't have a team wrapped around me right now, but it's understood, and we're talking about that. I'm not just handing it off and saying it's done, and then having them come back and say it's not done, it's not working. I might say, "I want you to run this through testing because I may have missed something, and I'm honest about that." And so you can offload a little bit of stuff to clients in that respect. But if you have a team, it's much better to do it before you show it to the client or you hand it off.
And there's some projects are just inherently you're not capable of testing. For example, you took an existing system and you're upgrading it, right? We're not creating test cases for every screen, every button, so there's some communication that needs to take place with the customer. Yes, we test stuff,
Yes.
but I'm not testing all this because we're not building. We are testing what road we lay. New stuff we do will be tested, but
Right.
you cannot go, "Hey, I've tested all this." Don't assume that I never did.
Sure. Or say to the client, "I can put somebody on this and they can spend 40 hours hammering on it if you'd like to pay for that." If you have an internal resource that can handle that understands the functionality more so, it would be recommended that you use that internal resource. When you review, I like to be face-to-face with a customer. That could mean video call. It doesn't necessarily mean I'm sitting across the table. There's something interesting, right, and insightful about seeing a reaction, about body language, about understanding kind of how that person is seeing that system for the first time. That is very, very valuable. I always refer back to the scope when I'm reviewing. So it's an important part of, I think, managing these projects is when you have a scope of work. What I've often seen happen, and I've I have done this too in the past, no question about it, is you have this scope of work and you've defined this project and then you sort of never look at that document again. Or you just sort of, you know what I mean? It just sort of goes away and you just kind of work on stuff for a while.
We're laughing because we don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
This seems like fantasy land.
Yeah. No one's ever done that. You know, maybe you just sort of estimate it at a very high level, and it's like, well, we're going to do contacts, and we're going to do invoices, and we're going to do inventory, and that's it, and that's as far as you go. There is some sort of scope of work in place. The framework that I use, the Agile framework, is written from a user perspective, so the user will be able to do something with the system, be able to perform a task, run a report, et cetera, et cetera. That is my scope of work. I'm always referring back to it, always pointing to that scope as this is the part of it that I'm reviewing. And the reason is obviously to determine what is suggested that is not within that scope. Do you have a question?
Yeah, well, that's my follow-up is how do you deal with scope creep? Because it's really one man's freedom fighter is another man's terrorist, right?
That's correct.
Like, well, I consider that in scope. I said, hell no, that ain't scope.
Right. It's a good question. I'm going to talk about that in one of my 10 elements. So you're reviewing with the client in some way. Again, this is the point of these 10 elements, is that even though you don't think about it, maybe you're just doing a meeting and handing off the software. That's a review with the client. It's the first time they see it. So how do you do that? Can you articulate how you do it, what it looks like, and are you teaching your clients so that they're aware of what's coming? Reporting is letting your client know how well you're doing or not well you're doing around the project itself. So things like budget reports and status reports would fold up under what I'm calling reporting. So again, let me just reiterate that if you don't have a formal process around this, you're still doing it. You're sending an email saying, I'm going to deliver it next week. That's your status update. Or the client, in a really bad case, is calling you and saying, where is my stuff? And you're saying, oh, yeah, I'm getting to it. That's your status update right there. So it's not that it might suck, but you're doing it. So if you can articulate a process and you can come up with ways of being proactive and sharing budget and status, then you're going to have a much better project in the end and a much better relationship with the client. I talk about money and status early and often. I talk about if it's a time and materials kind of project, which is the way I work, so budget's very important. I talk about money at the very first iteration. Say, this is how much of the budget we've used. This is how much of the budget's remaining. I feel like we're ahead. I feel like we're a little bit behind. I feel like we need to course correct. Whatever that conversation is, I do it right out of the gate. And the reason is because I want to establish a culture within my project that is honest and open, and we talk about money. Because if I don't, and things go bad downstream,
You don't get paid.
well, yeah, I won't get paid. But is that what you said?
Yeah, yes.
Go ahead.
But the problem is that if the first time that I'm talking about money with my client after they sign the proposal is 8 or 10 weeks in and there's a problem with the budget, I don't want, hey, we need to talk.
Negative energy.
What's that?
The negative energy.
Yeah,
in the
exactly.
air, you can feel it.
Right, they're basically, I don't want to introduce that topic for the first time and it be bad. I would rather have talked about the budget at 6 or 7 steps along the path when things are okay, and then I say, oh, you know what, we're going a little bit over here, or we're at risk of going over. This is a little bit more complicated than we thought it was going to be. We're spending a little bit too much time on meetings. We're blah, 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 blah. Whatever that is, it just becomes part of that normal conversation that we have, and it's not sort of a, it's not like Dad calling you in and saying, we need to talk, right? You obviously can customize these. I mean, some clients, depending on how you're billing the project, if you're flat feeing the project, you might not need to talk about the budget, the money part of it. You might just need to focus on the timeline, whatever. And changes. This is the scope creep question. How do you deal with changes that emerge? Well, first of all, at the beginning of the project, as a software developer, having been a software developer for a while, I explain to the clients not that you might come up with new ideas, but that you will come up with new ideas. There's no question about it. You're going to come up with new ideas because you're going to see things that are going to spark creativity in your own mind, right? And you're going to see capacity and capabilities of the software. you probably didn't imagine. So they will emerge. And rather than resisting the changes, and rather than resisting what used to be called, scope creep, or what would trigger a change form and require you to say, I'm going to charge you more money now, I welcome those ideas and I welcome those changes into the project. But I've got a process. And that's the point, is that I can articulate that process, and I do at the very beginning of the project and throughout the project. That if a new idea comes in, we're gonna put that idea on what's called an enhancements list. You can call it whatever you want. I like the word enhancements because it's positive. This is something that will enhance your software. And I'm going to track that idea. I'm going to track those additional features that aren't represented in my feature list. And when I track those things, we're going to do one of three things with them. We're going to prioritize them and determine if they're critical now. And if they're not, the first thing I might do is just say, let's phase that. Let's push that out. We'll do that at another time. We'll keep it. We'll keep the idea. It's a great idea. Let's move it to a later date, not within the scope of this particular project. The second thing that I might do with it is, if I'm tracking ahead, if I'm doing really well and I'm realizing that, hey, we've got good chemistry here, my estimates were conservative, and we're really beating the budget in a significant way, I might bring one or two of those in. Nothing says happy client like, yeah, I'm just going to throw that in, we're going to take care of it, it's going to be still part of that same budget. No, I'm T&M, so I'm still going to get paid to do it, right? But it's an expectation thing, right? The client's just happy. Nobody has ever pushed back on me for being able to do more than I promised for the same amount of money or deliver faster. Those two things are always making clients happy. The third thing I might do is negotiate with features that already exist in the scope. So I've got this scope, I've got this target, I've got this number I'm trying to get to, I'm trying to get this software built for this amount of money. Well, guess what? In the same way that ideas emerge and new ideas get introduced to a project, some features that were previously defined in the project are no longer necessary. It happens, right? Those 3 reports maybe could be consolidated into 1 report. Or maybe we can just throw a data table into table view and let the admins work on those, work on that table instead of developing a whole form or a whole layout dedicated to that. We can reduce the functionality somewhere else and save money. So in the third case, I might swap out features. Say, well, if this new idea is really that important to you, and I'm estimating it's going to take me maybe a half a day to do it, let's see if there's anything in the feature list that we could wait on. It'll keep it'll keep us on track with our budget, but we can negotiate. So those are just some ways of dealing with the dreaded scope creep, the thing that could cause a contentious relationship with that customer. Do you have a process around that? Yes. Can I articulate that to the customer? Yes, and I do often. And the home run around this is when your client comes to you and says, I've got an idea for the enhancements list. Then you know you did your job. Because they get it, and you are the only one who has taught them how to get it. And finally, deliver. So you roll it out, you realize the scope of the project, and you confirm approval. I have a process, I've got a form that I present, and it just explains sort of the next steps for the relationship. Talk about maintenance on the solution, talk about maybe another phase, whatever it is. It's just a very simple, hey, you did what you said you were going to do. I'm a happy customer. We sign it off and we're done. The process can be whatever you need it to be for your case, but the point is that you should have a process for final delivery of that software.
What percentage of the time do you stay on scope, do you feel?
I feel like I stay on scope all of the time because I'm constantly negotiating.
Well, that's what I mean. Yeah, that's what I was kind of getting
I mean,
to.
how often does the scope change? 100% of the time.
Yeah.
But how often do I manage to hit my numbers and keep my customer happy? All the time. Because if the scope,
initial scope that you.
From the initial scope, how often is it the same? Well, that's kind of what I'm saying. Is the actual
Never does.
Never.
So you always kind of work in the concept that you're going to set a budget, and you're going to work until that budget is done. Then we're going to decide if we want to go farther or find a place to stop earlier.
Absolutely.
More times than not.
I think, Gene, my view on that, if you want to have a more on-target estimate scope, you got to get small. You got to get smaller and smaller and smaller. And when you think you're small, you're not small enough. So when I say small, people are like, I want this system, and then I'm like, that's not small. I'm like, when I say small, I say like, how about a 2-screen prototype? They're like, wow. I'm like, no, that's small. That's a good small start. Let's see how big you want to go for. So the more you can get small, and then set that expectation to deliver little bits and pieces to meet their vision, then you're not going to be feeling like, it's very difficult to manage.
What I found the Agile thing does is it removes that question, because the idea of a defined scope and a number and a rigidity in the definition of a project, and then measuring the success of whether or not you hit that goal is addressed really in this method of saying, okay, we're going to set a number because I've got X number of dollars to spend on this, and now I'm going to negotiate with you along the way to make sure that if the number is super important and it's hard, then we're not going to exceed that, but I'm going to negotiate the features along the way with you. If in some cases more money can be added to it, that's fine. That's another option to the change slide that I forgot to mention, which is
Well, that's the feeling I got. The whole concept and stuff is to work and not to get a hard number out there to work. And you say break it up, keep it small.
But sometimes, that's the thing is that the critics of the method or of Agile in general is typically that, well, you don't know what you don't know. It's too loose, it's undefined, and that sort of thing. But what I found was that it's actually more realistic because the changes are inevitable. You know what I mean? And I can resist the fact that it's going to change and that the process is going to change and the business priorities are going to change. I can resist that and pretend it's not going to happen and try to fight toward the rigidity. Or I can say, well, it is going to change. It is going to happen. Now it's up to me to work with the client and to essentially convince the client that I'm a credible, trusted resource that is just as interested in a successful project as they are.
Well,
And then work to that toward that.
Flexible too, I feel like it delivers the highest level of satisfaction.
Yeah, absolutely. My goal is working software that addresses the outcome.
You mentioned sales process early in your discussion, but that's one of the tools that I like to use is describe the process that we're about to go on and tell them the story about, hey, here's a big detailed spec, see you in a few months. If that's what you want, I'm not your person. I just flat out say that right up front.
Yeah, it just doesn't work.
I can be your huckleberry in that case too. You're just going to need to pay me.
What's that?
Right? We can do that too, but you will be paying for that upfront roadmap of the world, right? It's going to take some time to journey that.
To build the roadmap.
Sure,
that roadmap.
Right, yeah.
Sure, but you've got a big organization. You can do both.
I'm just saying, like it is plausible, but it's just a different process.
Yeah,
Not free.
exactly. I think it's important that the customer feels comfortable that their buying process matches your selling process.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? Because that's where most of the disconnects take place.
Yeah, that's a great point.
A question, generally speaking, on the scope document, do you have a preferred size or thoughts with the customer?
In terms of how big the scope document?
Right.
Well, I'm articulating each feature as a line item, and the feature, just to give you kind of a scope of the feature is typically about 2 to 6 hours of FileMaker development. If that gives you an idea, right? So, if you have a 60-hour project, you can it might be 10 to 20 features or something like that. So the scope document is typically a couple pages, essentially, of a spreadsheet.
Maximum.
Yeah.
I limit mine to a page. If we can't describe what you want to do in phase one,
That's great. It's a great way of thinking about it. Yeah.
on a page, then I'm more than willing to work with you to get it down here, or you may need another consultant.
Yeah. No, that's a great way of thinking about
But you've never called us.
the constraints.
So you must be good at what you're doing.
And are you encouraging small?
Yeah, I'm encouraging small
Yeah.
in my case.
Yeah, I do as well. I mean, I just engaged with a customer, a new customer, and you know, in my space, I like small businesses, and you know, we talked about the whole thing, and I said, let's start with $10,000 worth of the whole thing. You know, let's just focus on that, and we'll work. You know, we'll get that rolled out. And the argument that I often make is, I want to introduce the technology and the infrastructure to the organization as well. Like, I don't want to roll out everything and also have this expectation that this massive system is also going to work flawlessly.
Right.
I'd rather introduce the technology, introduce it to a handful of users, get people comfortable with it, work out all the kinks that we need to work out, and then expand from there. FileMaker is a great platform for that. I mean, that's one of the beauties of it, right? Is that
Functional prototyping.
yeah, and you can just build on the foundation that you start with, so you can really keep it small.
No, I was trying to read Kevin's mind before. So.
We get lost. I can't even figure it out.
This is the website if you want to download that white paper and just have a little bit more details about. And again, my 10 elements, the way that I describe them, are wrapped around this Agile framework. But I would argue that regardless of the framework or the methodology, if you use a more rigid methodology or use a different one, I'm not a proponent of the Agile framework and saying that nothing else works and it's the only way. The way I like to think about it is that it works for me. It works for my style. It works for my kind of customer. And I found it to be a very successful way of doing things. So that white paper that's on that website is going to be really from that perspective at Illusion. You just click on the banner at the top and you get to it. That's what I have for you. I hope this was helpful in some way. So thank you.